Silence is not just the absence of words, it is the absence of access. And for a narcissistic woman, that absence is profoundly destabilizing. You see, her sense of control does not come from strength in the traditional sense, but from influence, subtle, emotional, psychological influence over the people in her orbit. She studies reactions, feeds on responses, and calibrates her behavior based on what she can provoke. In many ways, the dynamic becomes a kind of unspoken game where your emotions are the pieces she moves across the board. When you choose no contact, you don't simply step away. You remove yourself from the entire system. There is no feedback loop, no reaction to analyze, no emotional thread to pull. And this is where the real fracture begins. Because control for her depends on continuity. It depends on your presence, your engagement, your willingness, conscious or unconscious, to participate in the dynamic. Carl Jung often spoke about the shadow, the hidden, unacknowledged parts of the psyche that we avoid confronting. Silence forces confrontation. Without you there to reflect back, an image she can manage or manipulate, she is left alone with what she has long avoided: uncertainty, insecurity, and a fragile sense of self that cannot sustain itself without external validation. And so, your silence becomes something far more powerful than any argument or confrontation could ever be. It is not aggression, it is not retaliation, it is withdrawal of energy. And in that withdrawal, you dismantle the very structure that allowed her control to exist in the first place. This is why silence unsettles her so deeply, not because it hurts her ego in a superficial way, but because it exposes the truth she cannot escape, that her power was never absolute, it was borrowed. And the moment you take it back, everything begins to collapse. What follows from that silence is something even more unsettling for her, something far deeper than a loss of interaction. It is the exposure of her greatest fear, and that fear is not, as many assume, the loss of you as a person. It is the loss of control over you as a source of validation, attention, and emotional certainty. You have to understand, in this dynamic, your role was never just relational, it was functional. You reflected back to her a sense of importance, of influence, of psychological dominance. And when that reflection disappears, she is no longer simply dealing with your absence. She is confronting a void where her sense of control once existed. Carl Jung spoke often about the human tendency to avoid the unknown within ourselves. We construct identities, personas, and narratives to shield ourselves from deeper insecurities. For a narcissistic personality, that constructed identity is everything. It must be maintained at all costs. But your silence disrupts that maintenance. It removes the mirror. Without you responding, explaining, defending, or reacting, she is left without orientation. There is no emotional feedback to interpret, no signal to decode. And this creates a kind of psychological freefall. The mind begins to search for explanations. Why is he silent? Has he moved on? Does he no longer care? But without answers, those questions multiply and intensify. This is where anxiety begins to take hold, not because she misses you in a genuine, grounded sense, but because she can no longer locate herself within the dynamic she once controlled. The certainty is gone, and in its place is unpredictability, which is something she is deeply unequipped to tolerate. Silence, then, becomes a mirror of absence, a reflection not of you, but of what she lacks internally. And that is what makes it so powerful. It forces a confrontation with instability she has long avoided. And in that confrontation, one truth becomes unavoidable. Control was her illusion, and your silence is what breaks it. And once that illusion of control begins to fracture. Something even more fundamental is set into motion: the collapse of the ego itself, not the healthy ego that allows a person to function in the world, but the inflated, carefully constructed identity that depends entirely on external validation to survive. In this dynamic, her sense of self was never internally anchored. It was built through reflection, through admiration, attention, and emotional influence over others. You were not just part of her world, you were part of the mechanism that sustained her identity. And when you withdraw through silence, that mechanism begins to fail. Carl Jung described the ego as something that must be balanced by self-awareness, by an honest confrontation with the unconscious. But in the narcissistic structure, that confrontation is avoided at all costs. The persona, the image presented to the world, becomes rigid, exaggerated, and fragile. It cannot tolerate contradiction, and it certainly cannot tolerate absence. So when your attention disappears, it is not experienced as a simple loss. It is experienced as a threat to identity. The questions that arise are no longer about you. They become existential. If I cannot control him, what does that say about me? If he no longer validates me, do I still have value? These are not conscious reflections, but they manifest through emotional reactions that seem disproportionate: rage, desperation, sudden attempts to reassert dominance, or a shift into victimhood. This is what an ego collapse looks like in real time. The structure begins to crack, and without the usual reinforcement, it cannot hold its shape. The reactions you may witness are not signs of strength, but of instability, last attempts to regain a sense of control that is slipping away. And this is why your silence carries such weight. It does not attack, it reveals. It does not argue, it exposes. Because when the ego can no longer sustain itself without you, one truth becomes undeniable: what seemed powerful was, in fact, profoundly dependent. And as that ego begins to destabilize, we arrive at another layer of the dynamic, one that is often misunderstood, yet absolutely central to what is happening beneath the surface. What she has lost is not just your presence, but what psychologists often refer to as supply, not in a material sense, but in an emotional and psychological one. In this context, your attention was never neutral. It was fuel. Every reaction you gave, whether it was affection, frustration, confusion, or even resistance, served a purpose. It confirmed that she could affect you, that she occupied space in your zone, that she mattered in a way that reinforced her internal narrative of significance. And over time, this exchange becomes addictive, not necessarily in a conscious way, but in a deeply conditioned one. When you initiate no contact, that supply is abruptly cut off. There is no gradual decline, no soft transition. It is a sudden absence of stimulation that the psyche has grown dependent on. And like any form of dependency, the response is not calm acceptance, it is withdrawal. This is why her behavior may become erratic, even extreme. There may be attempts to provoke you, to re-engage you, to pull you back into the dynamic through any means necessary: candor, guilt, nostalgia, even apparent vulnerability. These are not random reactions. They are attempts to restore the flow of supply, to re-establish the connection that once sustained her sense of self. Carl Jung spoke of the dangers of unconscious patterns, how we become enslaved to behaviors we do not fully understand. In this case, the dependency on external validation operates beneath awareness, driving actions that may seem irrational from the outside, but are entirely consistent with a system that has lost its primary source of energy. And this is where your silence becomes decisive. Because by refusing to re-engage, you are not just protecting your peace, you are interrupting a cycle that can only continue with your participation. Remove the supply, and the system cannot sustain itself. And in that absence, one realization begins to emerge. What once felt like connection was, in truth, a dependency that could not survive without you. And in the midst of all this, her instability, the withdrawal, the collapse of familiar patterns, something equally significant is happening on your side. Though it is often less dramatic and therefore less immediately visible, power is returning to you. Not the kind of power that dominates or controls, but a quieter, more grounded form, the power of self-possession. When you step into silence, you are no longer reacting. You are no longer explaining, defending, or seeking to be understood within a system that was never designed for mutual clarity. Instead, you become still, and in that stillness, something shifts. Your energy, which was once outwardly directed toward managing her responses, anticipating her behavior, adjusting your own state, begins to turn inward. Carl Jung emphasized the importance of individuation, the process, of becoming whole by integrating the conscious and unconscious aspects of the self. What you are doing in this moment is a step toward that process. By withdrawing from the dynamic, you are no longer defining yourself in relation to her reactions. You are beginning to exist independently of them. And this independence creates a kind of psychological unpredictability that cannot be easily grasped or controlled. You are no longer a fixed point in her system. You are no longer available to be read, influenced, or managed. From her perspective, this is disorienting. From your perspective, if you remain grounded, it is liberating. But this shift requires discipline, because the temptation to respond, to re-engage, to explain yourself one last time, it will arise. And in those moments, it is important to recognize that every reaction you give is a step back into the very structure you are trying to leave behind. Your silence is not weakness, it is clarity. It is the decision to no longer participate in something that diminishes your sense of self. And when you hold that silence with consistency, something becomes undeniable, not just to her, but to you. The moment you stop reacting is the moment you begin to reclaim who you are. And when all of these elements converge, the loss of control, the exposure of fear, the destabilization of the ego, the sudden absence of supply, and your quiet return to self-possession, what remains is almost inevitable. The system as it once functioned cannot hold. And what you begin to witness is not a calculated response, but a kind of psychological unraveling. This unraveling does not always appear in obvious ways. It can take many forms. Sudden attempts to reconnect, emotional outbursts, indirect messages, or even calculated silence meant to draw you back in. At times, it may look like vulnerability, at others, like anger or indifference. But beneath these shifting expressions, the underlying pattern is the same: an attempt to regain equilibrium in a system that has lost its center. Carl Jung wrote about the tension that arises when the psyche is forced to confront what it has long avoided. That tension seeks release. And when there is no familiar path, no access to you, no way to restore the old dynamic, it begins to manifest as instability. What you are witnessing is not simply emotion. It is the psyche attempting to reorganize itself under pressure. This is why consistency becomes so important, because any break in your silence, any moment of re-engagement, offers a temporary restoration of the old structure. It gives the system just enough reinforcement to continue. But when your silence remains steady, something different begins to happen. The attempts lose momentum, the patterns weaken, the cycle, which once seemed endless, begins to exhaust itself. And this is the part that is often misunderstood. The meltdown is not something you cause in a direct, intentional sense. It is the natural consequence of a system that depended on your participation to survive. When that participation is removed, the instability that was always there simply becomes visible. So the question is no longer about her reaction. It is about your consistency, whether you remain anchored in the clarity you have found, or whether you allow yourself to be drawn back into what no longer serves you. Because in the end, silence is not just an absence, it is a boundary. And when that boundary holds, it does more than create distance. It brings an entire illusion to its natural end. And sometimes the most powerful action you can take is the one that requires no action at all.